3 runs. That's all it was. 3 runs on the scoreboard. 3 numbers that, in the context of a baseball season with 162 games and thousands of individual moments that blur together by October, should have meant almost nothing. But the Twins manager sat in front of the microphone after the game and said something that nobody in that press conference room was prepared for. He said, "We didn't need those 3 runs." The room went completely silent. And then he said the rest of it. To understand what he meant, you need to understand what happened in the inning before those 3 runs were scored. Ohtani had been dealing. That is the only word that accurately describes what the first 4 innings looked like from the opposing dugout. Not just pitching. Not just executing. Dealing, in the way that only a handful of pitchers in the history of this sport have ever truly dealt, with a combination of velocity and movement and competitive intelligence that made the Twins lineup look, at moments, like they had never held a baseball bat before in their lives. And then came the wild pitch. It happened on a 2-1 count in the 5th inning with a runner on second base. Ohtani wound up. The mechanics looked identical to every other pitch he had thrown that night. The arm path was the same. The hip rotation was the same. The release point, as far as anyone watching could tell, was the same. But the ball wasn't the same. It came out at 163 km/h and went nowhere near where it was supposed to go. It skipped hard off the dirt in front of the plate, ricocheted off the catcher's shin guard, and rolled toward the backstop with enough velocity that the runner on second broke immediately for third. The stadium made a sound that stadiums make when something unexpected happens, that collective inhale, half gasp and half groan, the sound of thousands of people processing the same surprising information at exactly the same moment. The runner reached third easily. Ohtani stood on the mound. And that is where this story actually begins. Because what happened next, in the approximately 12 seconds between the wild pitch and Ohtani's next interaction with the catcher, was something that several people in that stadium described afterward with language that belonged less to a baseball game and more to a nature documentary. He didn't look at the runner. He didn't look at the dugout. He didn't look at the umpire or the catcher who was retrieving the ball from against the backstop wall. He looked at nothing. Or rather, and this is the distinction that matters, he looked inward. With the intensity of a man who had just been handed a problem and was in the process of deciding, in real time, exactly how he was going to destroy it. One of the Twins' coaches, speaking to a reporter after the game, described it this way: "I've seen pitchers get angry after a wild pitch. I've seen them get flustered, get tight, lose the feel of what they were doing. I've even seen great pitchers let one bad moment unravel an entire outing. But I've never seen a pitcher look the way Ohtani looked in that moment. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something colder than anger. Something more focused. Like something locked into place inside him that hadn't been there before." He paused. Then said, "We knew immediately that we were in trouble." The next pitch was a 164 km/h fastball that the hitter didn't see. Not in the sense that he swung and missed, though he did. In the sense that, from the moment the ball left Ohtani's hand to the moment it arrived in the catcher's mitt, the entire sequence happened faster than the hitter's brain could complete the decision to swing. He was late. Significantly, embarrassingly late, in the way that elite hitters almost never allow themselves to be late against anyone. He walked back to the dugout looking like a man who had just been asked to solve a math problem in a language he didn't speak. The next hitter stepped in. 164 again. Same result. Different hitter. Same expression walking back to the bench. The third hitter worked the count. He was disciplined. He laid off 2 pitches that broke out of the zone. He fouled off a slider that had enough movement on it to belong in a different sport entirely. He made Ohtani work in a way that the previous 2 hitters hadn't. For a moment, just a moment, it looked like he might have found something. Some thread in the fabric of what Ohtani was doing that he could pull at. Then Ohtani threw a sweeper that started at his left hip and ended up on the outside corner of the plate, and the hitter stood there with the bat on his shoulder and watched strike three go past him. 3 pitches later, the inning was over. The runner who had reached third on the wild pitch never scored. The Twins scored their 3 runs in the 6th inning, after Ohtani had left the mound. They came off the bullpen, a 2-run single and a sacrifice fly that felt, in the moment, like they might matter. Like the game was still within reach. Like the deficit was something that could be managed if the Twins' own pitching staff could hold things in place while the offense found its footing. That is when the Twins' manager began to understand something. He understood it gradually, the way realizations arrive when you have been watching something without fully naming it, and then suddenly the name appears, and everything that came before it reorganizes itself around that name and makes a different kind of sense. He understood that the 3 runs his team had just scored had not made the situation better. They had made it worse. Here is the logic of what he saw. When Ohtani left the mound, the Dodgers led by a margin that felt manageable. 3 runs is not an insurmountable deficit in baseball. 3 runs is a big inning. 3 runs is one swing of a hot bat by the right hitter in the right moment. 3 runs is the kind of number that keeps a dugout alive, keeps at-bats competitive, keeps the energy in the building at a level where the game still feels like a game. But the manager had seen Ohtani's face after the wild pitch. He had seen what happened in those 12 seconds on the mound. He had watched, from across the field, as something shifted in the pitcher that was not going to shift back before the game ended. And he knew, with the certainty of a man who has spent decades reading baseball situations and the people inside them, that if his team gave Ohtani a reason to engage at that level again, they were not going to like what happened. The 3 runs gave him that reason. He explained it in the press conference with the careful language of a man trying to say something true without having it misunderstood. He said, "I want to be clear about what I mean. I'm not saying our players shouldn't have tried to score. That's not what I'm saying. They competed. They found a way to put runs on the board, and I'm proud of that. What I'm saying is that in terms of what it did to the other side, specifically to him, I think we would have been better served keeping the margin where it was." A reporter asked him to explain. He said, "When you score against a pitcher like that, in a game where he's already locked in at that level, you're not putting pressure on him. You're adding fuel. You're giving him something to respond to. And the last thing you want, when Ohtani is pitching and something has already flipped that switch inside him, is to give him more reasons to be locked in." He leaned back slightly. He said, "We scored 3 runs and I watched him in the dugout when he heard the score. And I thought, we just made a mistake. Ohtani didn't pitch the 6th inning. The innings limit was already decided before the game began. But what he did in the dugout after his outing ended was something that 4 separate Twins staff members mentioned independently when speaking to reporters in the days that followed. He sat at the far end of the bench. Alone, but not isolated. The distinction matters, because alone implies withdrawal, and this was not withdrawal. This was concentration. He sat with his eyes forward, watching the game unfold in front of him with the same intensity he had brought to the mound. Not celebrating. Not relaxing. Not doing any of the things that pitchers typically do when their outing is complete and the pressure of performance has been lifted. He was still in it. One Twins coach said, "I've seen closers in the 9th inning with that look. I've seen it on guys with everything on the line. But I've never seen a starting pitcher sit in a dugout after his work was done and look like the game was still happening to him. Like he was still competing even though he wasn't on the field anymore. It was unsettling. I won't pretend otherwise. It was genuinely unsettling." The story spread quickly when it broke publicly. The phrase the whole nation reached for first was the one the Twins manager had used, the confession that 3 runs, in this particular game against this particular pitcher, had been the wrong thing to score. It was counterintuitive enough to stop people mid-scroll. It was surprising in the specific way that only true things are surprising, not shocking for the sake of shock, but shocking because it revealed something real about the nature of what Ohtani is and how competing against him actually works. Former players weighed in. Analysts weighed in. People who had faced elite pitchers across eras of baseball tried to contextualize what the Twins manager was describing. Most of them said some version of the same thing. They said, "This is not a normal competitive dynamic. What he is describing is not how baseball is supposed to work. Scoring runs is supposed to help you. Closing the deficit is supposed to shift the momentum. That is the fundamental logic of the sport." And then they said, "But this is Ohtani. And Ohtani does not operate inside the fundamental logic of the sport." There is a version of this story that ends with statistics. With pitch velocity averages and strikeout rates and ERA projections and all the numerical language that baseball uses to translate what happens on the field into something that can be stored and compared and argued about. That version of the story is accurate. The numbers from that outing were historic in the specific way that Ohtani's numbers have a habit of being historic, not just good, not just elite, but genuinely outside the normal range of what the sport has seen before at this level of sustained consistency. But the version of the story that matters, the one the Twins manager was trying to tell when he sat in front of that microphone and said something that stopped a press conference cold, is not a statistical version. It is a human one. It is the story of a wild pitch that lasted 1 second. And a moment of stillness on the mound that lasted 12. And what grew in that stillness, what locked into place behind Ohtani's eyes in those 12 seconds, that turned an already exceptional performance into something that the opposing manager, days later, was still struggling to find adequate language for. He didn't need the 3 runs. What he needed was a reason. And in that 5th inning, standing alone on the mound with a wild pitch behind him and a runner on third and a stadium full of people waiting to see what he would do next, he found one. The monster, as they would come to call it, did the rest.